So a couple of little tips for tracking, and a couple of these things I learned in South Africa, where some of the best trackers in the world that I've ever been around anyway are. But I always have a stick with me, and this is something that my grandfather taught me when I was young, but I can use the stick to make a little mark next to a track. In particular, I'll do that when it's the last track that I see and I have to start making some circles and looking for other tracks. I'll make a little mark in the dirt, but also it just helps me concentrate on the tracks. I'll kind of track them with the stick and point as I'm following them, and it just helps me stay focused on the track that I'm on. You always want to carry some tissue or some toilet paper in your pocket, and this is a tip that I learned from a good friend of mine who's a South African tracker. So what I'll do is, where I see the last track, which is right there, and then on this side of the brush the ground's frozen, so I'm gonna have to look a little bit. So what I'll do is I'm just gonna take a little piece of this tissue and I'm gonna stick it on a branch right here by where my last track was. Now, the nice thing about using tissue or toilet paper, it's biodegradable. Once the first rain comes, this stuff will disappear out here, but it's bright enough, especially in this country, that it's easy to pick up with the eye. So always carry toilet paper or tissue paper and mark your last track with it when you lose a track. One thing you want to do when you're tracking is look for the path that makes the most sense for the animal to go through. Oftentimes when you're on a track, you can spot these sight lines that are the obvious paths for the animal to go. Focus your eyes there, or at least put some energy on those spots, and oftentimes that'll be where the track is. When you're tracking, it's easy to stay focused on the ground, but you need to keep your eyes up and look around too, especially if you're tracking an animal that could be dangerous at all. So you make sure you track, and then you stop and you look up and you look around. But when you look up, make sure you know where your last track was. So I'm following the tracks and they're following this trail right here. So one thing I want to do as much as possible is I like to walk beside the track, and that just diminishes the chances of me messing up any of that spoor along there. Use a stick as a pointer, stay off the spoor, walk beside the track that you're tracking as much as possible. Always carry tissue in your pocket to mark your last track when you've lost it. And pause often to stop and look around, but make sure when you do that you visually and preferably physically mark that last track that you saw before you take your eyes off of it. Another thing about tracking I would say is, don't just track when you're out hunting. I track all the time when I'm out walking through the desert for two reasons. One, it keeps my tracking skills sharp, but the other thing is it also teaches me a lot about the habits of the animals out here. Over the years of following the tracks of all the different animals, you really learn a lot about their habits, what they're eating. You see where they nibbled on little things. You can see patterns in their tracks. You can see which animals are territorial and how big their territory is. You'll notice that, like, the cottontail rabbits will have a fairly small territory. You can follow a cottontail track around and really identify the area where that rabbit's most likely to be at. Jackrabbits will range a little farther. Cats, cougars, bobcats, they'll have bigger territories. Coyotes will range for miles and miles and miles forever. And then different animals will have different territories at different times of the year. So all these things you can learn from tracking. All these things you can learn without ever seeing an animal, just by following the tracks and the sign of the animals all around you. Donkey. Say something about your nyala.
This is one of the most amazing things that's ever happened to me.
Second pig of the day in South Africa. Nice work.